Do you ever find yourself reacting really strongly to certain situations? I know I used to. These are emotional triggers, and today I'm going to help you understand and learn how to start managing them better so that you can have more calm and predictability in the interactions in your life. Good morning and happy Friday. Hope you're all having a good week so far. First of all, let's start with figuring out what emotional triggers are anyway. For me, this is more of an intense reaction to a specific stimulus, and often this triggers a past experience or memory, and then it makes it come alive again within ourselves. Being able to figure out what those things are can be really important to help you feel calm on a regular basis. So, have you had an experience where it's a regular day, you're feeling pretty good, and then all of a sudden something happens, and for whatever reason, you're just overcome by some kind of emotion? Maybe it's fear, maybe it's guilt, maybe it's sadness, but it can be much larger than the situation that occurred. And this disproportionate reaction is pretty indicative that there's been some kind of triggering response. And if you look back on your history, maybe you can see a pattern in what has triggered you, the way that someone looked at you, or the words that someone used, and then link that back to something that happened before that's creating a similar response or kind of reawakening those same emotions in you. I would advise you, if you're curious and you're looking for patterns, to start writing these things down. So, keeping a bit of a journal and just noting situations that cause strong emotions. And again, searching for patterns so that you can learn how to understand what is going to potentially trigger you in a situation and what that root underlying cause is. I have an example from a recent podcast interview that I did. It was an unusual podcast interview, let's say. So the guy is looking for guests so that he can do some live coaching within the podcast with the idea that afterwards, the people that he interviews might become clients of his, which actually seems like a really good marketing strategy. Anyway, he wanted to know about what it was for me that was a block or a barrier to being where I want to be in my business. And I was telling him, it's the fear of visibility, it's wondering what other people are going to think of me, all of these things. And he was asking, like, okay, and are these things thoughts or feelings? Are they thoughts or feelings? And I'm like, they're feelings. And he's like, you haven't done work on the feelings, and that's why you're still in the place that you are and not where you need to be. And I was like, "Mm." I had a strong response to that. And I was like, okay. But it was interesting. It was interesting to try to do this introspection in real time, knowing that it was recorded with someone who I had just met. And I was like, you know what? That is triggering for me. Like, it's irritating me. And I think it's because of this. So we talked about it. And I do still think I need tons more work getting in touch with my emotions and my feelings and being able to process them. But it's nice when you can start to notice things and at least talk about them, even if all of the talking in the world can't necessarily change them. The feeling needs to be there. But if we don't have awareness in the first place, then we're not going to be able to make any headway on these things. So that's an example from recent history that I hope nobody listens to because it was kind of an embarrassing interview. But hopefully it helped him and he got some practice. And it sounds like on his show, tons of people have similar responses. So it's not like I'm the only one who's ever dealt with imposter syndrome or fear of visibility. So, yes, those things can certainly be triggering, especially when people say something about you that reflects how you already feel inside yourself. Those are the things that I find to be the most triggering. For you, just notice if you make this list whether that happens. If it's something that is partially true for you, even if it's not something you want to believe, that can be more triggering emotionally than something that you know is completely false. And he gave this example that I really like because I think it makes sense when you give a different analogy. So, for example, say you want to speak up at a work meeting, but you don't think that you are smart enough, good enough, have enough credentials to do that in front of the people that you work with, perhaps. He gave the example of, okay, are you a thief? And I was like, is this a trick question? No, I am not a thief. And he was like, great. How much time do you spend worrying about whether or not to steal stuff? And I said, no time at all. It doesn't bother me. And he's like, yeah, that's because no part of your identity or belief system is that you are a thief or you shoplift or whatever. Whereas with the speaking in public, with going to your work meetings and saying something, if you believe in some even small part that your ideas aren't as good as other people, your voice isn't worthy of being heard, then you run into problems because that belief continues to perpetuate in your actions, in your behavior, and then maybe you don't speak up, or maybe when you do speak up, you're looking down and you're not saying things very confidently. So these emotional triggers, whether or not they're because of something that someone else has said to you or a situation externally, will create an observable behavior. And those things can also be really helpful in being able to identify those situations. So maybe you find yourself like slouched over, head down, eyes down. That might be a really strong indication for you that you've been triggered. Just another thought for you to keep in mind if you are going on this journey of figuring out what's triggering you. Next, I'd like to talk about what to do when you are bumping up against those negative thoughts. Being able to reframe, I find, is a technique that's really important. And this cognitive technique, it's not an emotional technique, but the cognitive reframing allows you to change the way that you think about a situation so that the feelings and the emotions that are evoked within your body can change. And then your perspective takes on a more positive light than what it was before. For example, if you encounter a trigger, you can ask yourself, is there another way that I can look at this situation? For me, I try this in my relationships, in my work. I try to look for ways in which I can reframe the situation that takes me out of my own head. Because ultimately, we are projecting from our own thoughts, experiences, and projecting that onto situations. So when we do that, and it's not really helpful if we only have our perspective, because as we've talked about before, we have a ton of filters that distort, generalize, and delete the information that we're taking in from our environment, and we do not get the full picture. In yesterday's podcast example that I gave you, I attempted to take myself out of the situation as an observer, and this is a really cool NLP technique called perceptual positions. And in this technique, we have this triangle dynamic, at least if it's you in a conversation with another person or party. So we've got your position, the other person's position, and then this observer position. What you can do in this situation is view what happened from your position first, what was going through your head, what your thoughts and emotions and reactions were, and then you can imagine coming up out of your body and floating into the other person's position, and then you see yourself from their eyes, talking, responding, whatever, and then you have a bit more altitude to assess, oh, okay, maybe I have compassion for myself because of what everyone might go through in such a situation. Or I wonder what was going on for her when I said this thing. Clearly she's reacting. I wonder why she's reacting, instead of being judgmental or more cruel in your assessment. And then the last position which you can use is the position of that observer, bringing yourself out as an objective entity and going, this person over here said this person over here said this. I can see how she responded to what he said and maybe what he was thinking based on how she responded. And then you can use that observer position to come back to your position and go through that role playing again in the way that you want it to be and with more depth of understanding than when you started. And I really like that technique for that reason because it allows you to, again, gain that altitude and change your perspective to reframe how you might have initially responded into something that's a bit more compassionate or at least not as negative towards yourself, because often that's what can happen when we get emotionally triggered. The trigger has some kind of negative connotation and typically brings up uncomfortable feelings in our bodies. Last but not least, we're going to talk about coping strategies. Obviously, when you get triggered, it can be quite uncomfortable, as I just mentioned. Being able to have strategies to fall back upon to manage those strong emotional responses is really helpful. And we've talked about this a lot in the group in terms of different techniques you can use, whether it's straw breathing, in through the nose, out through pursed lips, long exhalation, or burst breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth, in through the nose, out through the mouth, really quickly. Even squeezing and contracting your muscles so that you stay in your body. If you have a tendency to dissociate or start shutting down, those can be really helpful ideas when you are in a triggered situation. And if you aren't having a good time there or something is just feeling too overwhelming, it's okay to remove yourself from that situation too. You definitely don't have to stay there because why would you do that to yourself? You wouldn't want to see somebody else suffer. So if you can realize that, gain some more self-awareness about what the situation is outside of the situation, then likely you can return to it. And if it's a conversation, continue it and have it a little bit more calmly. If you are someone who likes to do meditation or mindfulness, this can be a really helpful time to breathe, to sit in stillness, and just let your thoughts collect. And maybe you even write them down after. Journaling and free flow writing can be incredibly helpful, and you never know what's going to come up when you do an exercise like that. Something that I've learned more recently in NLP and wholeness work is sitting again and maybe closing your eyes and turning within and just noticing where in your body you're feeling that emotion or physical sensation and then describing it. Perhaps it's in your abdomen, upper abdomen, and it's tightness or it's swirling or it's clenching. And then if you can, imagining it dissipating and floating away like smoke and breathing into it and seeing if you can just change it. Often those strong emotional responses in our physical bodies end up being quite tight and held. So being able to relax and release into it can be a good way to let the emotions get processed through your body. And there are some other really cool techniques using the wholeness protocols that allow you to change your perspective and look at different areas of the body where you are holding tension and seeing how they relate to other places. It's kind of abstract, I will say, however, really, really effective, and you just feel more in touch and in tune with your body afterwards. Those are examples that I have for you in managing emotional triggers and the responses to them. In this video today, we talked about what emotional triggers are and how they might show up in different situations and how you can start to track them in order to look for patterns. We also talked next about reframing situations in which there might have been some negative self-talk or some lack of compassion on your part towards yourself. And I talked about the perceptual positions exercise that is really helpful in NLP to do that. And then lastly, we talked about some coping strategies or management strategies that you can use when you are feeling triggered in a situation. One of them is just removing yourself from the situation so that you can do whatever it is to calm yourself and your nervous system down. I would love to hear what you think of this video, and if you're brave, I would also love to hear which situations trigger you the most. I'm always curious to learn. If you would care to share in the comments, I will look forward to reading them later. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and we will talk next week.